Hello everyone. In today's video, I thought I would round up the two videos that I've previously made about my trip to Cancun and Oaxaca, and just talk a little bit more generally about solo traveling and some of the things that I think are amazing about solo traveling, some of the things that I keep in mind, and I hope that this is useful for anyone who might be interested in embarking on a solo trip. I know solo traveling is not for the faint-hearted, and rightfully so. There's so many things to be scared about if you really think about it, but the reality is that it's not almost as bad as it seems. There are a couple of things that I do think is important to keep in mind when you are thinking of your solo travel plans and kind of where you want to go and if it's suited to solo traveling. It is extremely important that you do your research. I mean, most of the tips that I'm going to share here are going to sound like no-brainers, but you'd be surprised by the amount of people that may not really think about this or may not understand that just kind of making a plan would actually be your best friend when you are planning to solo travel. So research is the first thing to keep in mind. Research. Not all countries are made equally. That is just the reality. And even in the city I live in Dublin, Ireland, and there's certain parts of Dublin that I wouldn't want to be at a certain time, and that goes for many, if not every city and every location in the world. So it's really important to keep in mind where are you going to, what is the current situation with regards to safety in those places. If you're a female traveler, you know, what are the things that we hear online, and hopefully from other YouTubers that have been to that destination, what do they say about those places and how are their experiences. It's important to take all of this information into consideration and make a decision that works best for you. But I would really emphasize on do your research, leverage, you know, obviously this amazing platform, YouTube, blogs, TikTok, Instagram, to hear about other people's experiences, and then do your own research also with regard to things like race. It's not the most fun topic, but I think it's important to understand how maybe people that look like you have experienced certain countries. I know there's a trend on TikTok where people say the places that they feel safe in as a Black person or as a member of the Latinx community. So it's really important to do your research also from that angle, and then also with regards to if you're a female and how women actually in those destinations. So research is important. Look into how this country that you're thinking of welcomes guests that look like you. The second thing is, let's assume you've done your research, you are at the destination that you wanted to visit. The second thing to keep in mind is you must be alert. The reality is that when you're traveling in a group, there's safety in numbers, right? So you should always be aware, but you know, if you're not aware, someone else might be aware for the group. When you're traveling by yourself, the sole responsibility of your safety really falls on you. So really do be very, very cautious. Keep in mind your surroundings. Is there someone that's followed you after a couple of turns? And it's not to make you paranoid, but it's the same level of awareness that you would have in an unknown environment that you really should keep an eye on when you're traveling. Safety is the biggest thing, and there's nothing that ruins an amazing destination more than a terrible experience. else to keep in mind is to communicate your plans with family. I cannot stress enough that it's important to let people in your life, your friends and loved ones back home, know where you are. Not only does it also put them at ease, but also makes you feel better. There's something about it I've found when I travel and I'm constantly sharing, okay, I'm going here for dinner, I'm going on this tour bus, it's like the contact details for this tour that I'm going on. You feel safe also knowing that someone else knows where you are, and if something ever were to happen, which hopefully it won't, at least someone can speak to that, and someone can contact whoever may need to be contacted. But be very serious about letting people know where you are. You also feel a lot safer. I actually believe that I don't know if this is the same for every country, but I know for example in the US that there is a program which I think is called the STEP program. I'll insert the name of the program and also link it below, where you can actually alert the embassy of the US in the country you're visiting about your location and what it is that you might be doing, just so the government is also aware. Again, I know it sounds silly, but you can never ever be too careful. Another thing that is really important is, as you travel wherever it is you may be, if you're going to be in taxis, taking local buses, depending on the location, you might feel safe with different types of forms of transportation. If you want to use more public transportation in certain countries I've never been to, but like if you're in the train in South Korea, I mean, I don't think you have anything to be worried about. But if you're taking a colectivo in a city in Mexico, you might want to be just make sure that you have your wits around you with your items, and making sure that you have your most valuable items closest to you. If you're going to be in a taxi in some places like the US, for example, I mean, you can use Uber, and there is a couple of measures that have been put into place where your safety can be guaranteed to an extent on Uber. If you're flagging down a taxi in the middle of nowhere in somewhere that you don't feel safe in, that's a different thing. So keep in mind, make sure that before you get into a taxi, especially if your instinct tells you to, maybe take a picture of the plate number and send it to a friend so that they know that this is where you're at. If you're coming from the airport, make sure that you take a taxi with a company that looks legit, maybe that has an office at the airport, and not some random guy that is not affiliated with any of the taxi companies that has a loan car somewhere. Don't get into that taxi. So just be careful, and some of these very obvious things really can be the difference between you feeling safe and a trip that turns out in a way that you may not want it to. Something else to keep in mind is where you stay. Your accommodation will also really help you go to an extent in feeling safe. So for me, my last trip to Mexico, I made a conscious choice to stay in the hotel zone in Cancun. That was my choice. But I could have also easily stayed in a different location, maybe in downtown Cancun, and felt just as safe. But I wanted to do that for me to feel safe. It's also really important to listen to what makes you feel comfortable, and that may look different for different people. Some people may feel very comfortable staying in a hostel in a particular location, while someone else might feel much more comfortable, much more safer if they're by themselves and staying in a nicer place. For me personally, I would almost always pick a nicer hotel when I'm by myself, and I'm happy to rough it when I'm in a group. But when it comes to accommodation, I almost would always suggest to stay in a hotel, or at least a hostel that has a presence where there's someone that knows you're coming at this time. There's a room where they have your details, they have your passport details, like all of this information I think is important. And just someone in that country knowing that I'm coming into the country has some of my details makes me feel at ease, as opposed to an Airbnb with someone that I don't know. I wouldn't feel so comfortable going to an Airbnb by myself. So one of the things I found is when you're traveling by yourself, you may not be able to do certain things. So for example, you might find that some tours, for example, require minimum 2 people, which is so frustrating when that happens. And I've definitely been there, and I can absolutely relate. So the reality that you might need to compromise some of the things that you want to do to an extent. So you may not be able to do certain things because maybe there are a requirement in terms of like participants, so you may not be able to do that. I know that when I was in Mexico, I wanted to take part in a cooking class, and the cooking class was cancelled because there was only one participant, myself, that signed up, and they had a minimum number of 2 people participating for them to carry on with the session. So you might deal with some of those things, but that's normal. Just keep in mind that you might need to compromise and adjust your plans accordingly. So instead of doing maybe something that is maybe not so popular, you might need to do more touristy things, because then there's a higher number of people participating, and it's very rare that it would be cancelled because only one person signed up. Most likely there'll be more people that have signed up. I should also state that many of the tips that I'm going to be sharing here are very much in line with if you're traveling by yourself, maybe are not planning to drive in that location, so you're a bit more restrained. You have certain constraints with regards to how you can move around. So those 2 things are really important. You're on your own. You probably won't be driving, and so you would definitely have to rely more on tour buses. You might have to rely more on you DIYing your trip yourself. Another thing to be aware of when you're traveling by yourself is not to do anything that will draw too much attention to yourself. So be careful about really flashy jewelry. Again, this also is very dependent. I know, for example, when I'm in Dubai, I feel very, very safe, and I've been in Dubai by myself. So even though I wasn't particularly traveling solo, I spent a week up to 2 weeks by myself, whilst my friends that live there were busy doing their own thing, and I spent a lot of time by myself. So I went to restaurants by myself, I went to to eat by myself, and I went to have drinks by myself, and I went on tours by myself, etc. So in certain locations, again, which is where my previous point comes into mind, just really be aware and observe what is the norm in where it is that you're going to, and how your behavior or how you may be, or how certain things may stick out more. So if someone likes to buy flashy jewelry, I don't think anybody would bat an eyelid much because also depending on the part of the city that you're going to be at. No one would look at you twice. Whilst, for example, if we're traveling solo in some cities, maybe in Mexico, you might need to be more careful that you don't draw too much attention to yourself in a way that someone that doesn't have the best intention spots you. So it really is really necessary. Whilst, for example, there are certain parts of Mexico that I went to and I felt so much safer than I would in certain parts of Dublin and Ireland. So it really is dependent, but generally speaking, I would always recommend keeping any flashy items or super expensive items, like super expensive cameras, super expensive jewelry, etc. Just keep that to a minimum, and actually maybe not wear them if you can, just so that you don't increase you don't attract any unwanted attention. That would be my personal recommendation. Just you want to blend in, and you just want to go about your things. Another thing I would also keep in mind is I feel like every city has, and this advice is actually regardless of if you're traveling solo or not, but it also ties back to the research part. Be aware that every city has some kind of tourist scam, especially if they're a tourist destination. There will be a scam that is specific to that city that tourists may be susceptible to. So it's really important that when you're doing your research, not only are you doing your research with regards to safety and if it's safe for women, if it's safe for LGBTQ community, etc. You also want to do your research with regards to tourists, right? And I think YouTube is a great resource for that. So double check what are the tourist traps, and see how you can avoid them. The ones at the airport are almost, I feel like, ubiquitous in every tourist destination, where they are charging you ridiculous prices. I dealt with taxi situations in Marrakesh. I wasn't traveling solo on that trip, but there was a scam I didn't know about, where the taxi drivers will almost be charging you per person for a taxi ride, whilst they would never do that to a local, or they would charge you, almost not even double, sometimes quadruple the price if they see that it's a tourist that is trying to flag them down. So keep in mind, what is the tourist trap in the destination that you're considering, and how can you avoid that? What are the known prices and things like that? So that would be a main one that I would highlight. Brings me to the end of this video. I would just say, to end this, I would say, if you've clicked on this video, you're most likely thinking about solo traveling, and I have found it to be personally a very rewarding exercise, a rewarding experiment, let's say. I understand that it can be very very nerve-wracking to think about, and maybe not. Sometimes people want, like, what am I going to do by myself? How am I going to keep myself company? I find solo traveling to be an interesting way to discover how comfortable you are with yourself. And it's definitely something worth experiencing at least once. You don't have to go to the other end of the world to do it. You can do a solo travel trip locally, maybe to a different city in your country, maybe to a different part of your city that you've never been to before, or you could go to a very exotic destination. But every time I've traveled by myself, I've learned a new part about myself, how resilient I can be, how independent and self-sufficient I can be if I want to. Like I said, it really takes a lot of responsibility, because you are fully responsible for your safety and for your enjoyment. So I would highly recommend doing it. To answer that question with regards to what am I going to do, I have 2 or 3 tips. So the first is, don't worry too much about that. Like, I know it's the first thing that comes to people's mind, but it's not going to be as much of a thought as you think it's going to be. If a lot of things are stopping you from going on a solo trip, what you might do, and if you'll be lonely, is not something I would encourage you to not let that be your blocker. Do it regardless of that. In terms of what to do, so usually when I'm by myself, I look for restaurants that maybe have live music, something I can watch and enjoy. I look for restaurants and seats that have a lovely view, so I can enjoy my meal whilst looking at something. I find those little things to really help me enjoy the space, as opposed to sitting in a corner where I can't see anyone other than other people eating with their friends and family. So I always find it really important to specify that I would like a view, or I book a restaurant that has a live band, or I go somewhere that has a lovely view towards the sunset and things like that. Like, I always adhere also to more cultural parts, or I like holidays that are more, if I'm traveling by myself, for them to be more cultural and be more about the environment that I'm in, and less partying and things like that. Whilst there's nothing wrong with that, I don't find that for me to be a compatible activity with solo traveling. So I would recommend, don't worry too much about, am I going to be lonely, am I not going to be lonely? You're only going to know if you go. If you go on a solo trip and you hate it, then you hate it. But don't knock it before you try it. Don't worry too much about if you're going to be lonely or not. But keep in mind that there are other ways you can elevate certain experiences. Go on a group tour. Like I said, go for dinner with something where you can engage with, like, a beautiful view, music, for example. Something else I would add to that is also be strategic in your time. Make sure that, maybe in the morning you're going to have brunch in this cute, lovely cafe around the corner. Then you have a tour booked at this museum, and then maybe you're going back to your hotel in the afternoon, late late afternoon to relax and just take a shower and change, and then in the evening you're going to go for this dinner where there's a live band. Like, try to be strategic in how you plan your day. I feel like when you're in a group, you can just let the trip happen to you, but when you're by yourself, you really must be strategic in the sense that you want to make sure that you have activity planned and you also have rest planned as well. And I hope that all of these tips encourages you, makes you excited about taking the plunge to go on that solo trip. If you do and you found any of the things I've mentioned here helpful, do let me know in the comment section below. And thank you so much for listening. I hope you found it useful. If you like the video, do consider subscribing. And yeah, thank you, and see you in the next one.